Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed the session so far this morning and this afternoon. And now I invite you to join us for the public lecture. I'd first like to thank our plenary sponsor, the University of British Columbia. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Love-Ese Chile. Dr. Chile is the owner and technical director of the circular waste research and testing company Regenerative Waste Labs in Vancouver. She is a sustainable material researcher whose focus is on developing circular bioeconomy-based solutions that recover value-added products from organic waste. She is a vocal supporter of sustainability, green chemistry, and community-driven science. As a person who comes from diverse backgrounds personally and professionally, Dr. Chile is driven to connect people who may not usually come together in order to co-create products and services that will lead our communities into a greener and more equitable future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chile to give her talk entitled Bold Strides Forward, a Scientist's Perspective on Sustainable Futures. Dr. Chile, over to you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. I really appreciate that kind introduction. And thank you so much to the organizers for putting on an amazing conference. Today has just been really fantastic to see all the different research being discussed. So thank you so much. So ready to pull up my slides, please. Okay. Yes, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where in the world you're joining us today. As Diane said, I am Dr. Love-Ese Chile, founder and technical director of the Regenerative Waste Labs. So my background is in circular economy, sustainable materials, and organics waste management. And today I would like to share with you how I have been trying to integrate my scientist's perspective into my work in the sustainability field. But first, as always, I like to start my presentations talking a little bit more about me. So I always like to begin these presentations just giving the audience an idea of my biases and values so that you can know a little bit about where I'm coming from when I'm joining these conversations. So I am a researcher primarily, which means I really value evidence-based decision-making. And so not just the experimental evidence that we generate in our research labs, but also the experiential evidence that comes out of the people who are working or living in a community on the ground every day. I'm also a consultant, which means I really value conversation, collaboration, and communication. So bringing together stakeholders who would not usually come to the table, sitting them all down and really discussing the root causes of issues and gaps within our infrastructure so that we can start to make greater strides forward together. I'm also an entrepreneur, which means I really appreciate creating innovations and technologies that will further action within the sustainability space. And finally, though some days it can feel like a bit of a dirty word, I am a millennial, which means I really value honesty, transparency, and radical forward thinking. So I founded a company called the Regenerative Waste Labs. And at the Waste Labs, we really take a whole system approach to the design, procurement, and production of sustainable products and packaging. So using this approach, we evaluate the science of how products break down in both natural and controlled environments. And we use this information to help inform product designs, both internally within our company and with the clients that we work with through our consulting stream. We also consider the social and economic dynamics of the marketplace to advise our clients on the best materials to use. So sometimes we might be thinking about recycling or composting as the best end of life, but really trying to understand how products are being used will help us inform and communicate the best choices to some of our clients. We also work hard, our analysts are really looking and analyzing the waste management industry to identify gaps where we could try to design new technologies that will close the loop on biomaterials. So I'll speak a little bit more about biomaterials as we move forward through this conversation today. But there's just so many opportunities that biomaterials bring to our landscape, where they could be recycled and composted in varying different ways to really add value into our systems. So in my day-to-day life, I'm an avid supporter and advocate for sustainable development and the transition into a green economy. And I'm really lucky to have the opportunity to speak in forums like this, the Black Excellence in STEM conference. And when I do, I really like to speak more from my position as a solar punk storyteller. So for those who don't know, solar punk is a genre and art movement that envisions a future which incorporates green and sustainable innovations in order to solve the grand challenges we face. Now, this movement aims to change the way that we talk about the future and to create stories that can turn into action. Stories are so important in the sustainability movement. It's often that we're confronted with images and stories about the environment and our social systems that can lead us to a place of despair and complacency. But by creating new stories, new aspirations, and new visions for our future, we can bring people together and stir their imagination. In these stories, we can center ourselves and share dreams from our perspective. We can spark conversations about how to create a future and a culture that connects and protects. And these stories we create are stepping stones that will inspire us to make these visions into reality. And the one story that I really love to tell is about how we can create a regenerative culture. In this story, we recognize that the current system that's been built is leading us down a destructive path. And this story emphasizes the opportunities within these challenges that we face. The opportunity to address issues of the environment, as well as issues of equity, justice, and freedom, issues of togetherness and community. We can work collaboratively to dream up new technologies that harness the power of the sun, of the flowing water, and we can reshape our cities so we're surrounded by plants and creatures. We can dream and aspire to become one with our environment rather than separate from it. So this is not a story of blame or shame. It's a story of human hope, human love, and human creativity. It's a story that gives us a chance to strive for good and a chance to strive for better. And for me, I came to find this story over time as I progressed through my personal and professional life. As a young person, I always had my head in a book, and I was generally a lot happier reading alone in my room than trying to engage with other people. And so I grew up in a place where my ancestors did not live. I grew up in Auckland, New Zealand, so a small island in the middle of the Pacific. Definitely a beautiful place to grow up. But looking back, I've come to realize that when I was growing up, I was transplanted into a context that I didn't fully understand, and also a context that didn't fully understand me. And so in my search for understanding, I turned to science and chemistry, whose stories I felt were a great way of deciphering the world around me. I learned about atoms and molecules and ions, and theories that I could see replicated in so many systems, from the micro to the macro. I studied plastics and catalysis, the interaction between heat and viscosity, and over time, I came to understand the sources of the environmental issues that have been afflicting our current systems. So as I continued my journey and started to navigate the academic system in North America during my graduate studies, the experiences I had there really encouraged me to start to broaden my learning, to incorporate ideas of ethics, equity, and justice. I read a lot about the sordid history of science and the people that they displaced and kept out of those institutions. And I spent hours discussing with my peers the intersection between science and the society, seeking to understand how the development of technologies, which has impacted so many aspects of our life and changed different social structures, and in some ways has led to wealth and prosperity for some, but inequality and poverty for others. And I did so many different things. I started book clubs where we'd sit down and read fiction and try to see how these stories that we were telling have influenced the technology and the science that we've done, and how the technology and science that we've created have influenced the society that we live in. And so my academic career really motivated me into action. And I started down the entrepreneurial pathway, seeking to understand how we can start to really make this sustainable transition. And while I was learning a lot, I was actively working to dismantle as many of the inequitable structures within my own business as possible. I still am trying to navigate that space. I think really deeply about how I, as an avid anti-capitalist, can really continue to push my business forward and continue to amplify and support and give power back to my employees. And this is an ongoing work in progress. I took courses where I learned the language of business and the motivations that our current economic system rewards. And through my time as both a consultant and a business owner, I've worked with policymakers and regulators to really try to understand how we can create enabling frameworks that encourage new innovations, but ensure that we have accountability. And so these three main areas of understanding have shaped who and where I am today. And I'd like to share with you some of what I've learned along this journey. And that's not to say that this journey is over, and I'm sure there's many more things to learn. But in true solar punk form, I'd like to tell you these stories, this perspective that I bring in the form of three stories. A story of energy, a story of equilibrium, and a story of entropy. So let's dive right in. So our first story is about energy. A chemist sees the world as an entangled mesh of molecules interacting, a series of ever-evolving connections governed by entropy, in constant flux, guided by energy, and limited only by their momentum and velocity. The law of energy conservation states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only converted from one form to another. And atoms love to ride this energy flow, transferring and sharing energy to become molecules, molecules always in constant flux, moving fluidly from one energy state to the next, absorbing energy to move higher and releasing it to come back to the ground. And in my search to understand how to make sustainable products and how we can get them to enter our marketplace more effectively, I started to see the system in the perspective of energy flow and flux. When we look at the way that our society creates materials and products, these also have a flow. Like atoms and molecules, they move from one state to the next. Energy has to be put into each stage to get our materials to move through this system. We take materials from the environment, we can turn them into products, and we send them around the world to use them. And finally, we dispose of them. But what you might be able to notice from this flow diagram here, in this take, make, waste model, is that the system energy only flows in one direction. And when we keep putting energy into a system without allowing that energy or those materials to move back to the ground state or flow in the opposite direction, that's when we generate a lot of waste and a lot of problems kind of come about. In circular systems, there are mechanisms that allow energy and materials to flow in both directions. In one way, we make products, and the other, we can repair, reuse, refurbish, recycle, and recover our materials to bring them back to the ground state, ready to be used again. So here in this diagram, we have lots of circular life flows for our materials. In the smallest loop, we have repair, where we think about creating products that can be easily disassembled, and we can give guides to our customers so that they can be easily repaired in order for them to be kept in use for longer. In the next loop, we have reuse, where we can design systems to collect products in order for them to be reused by the seller or repurposed to be reused by the customer. We can finally think about refurbishing products, designing them so that they could be disassembled and repaired by the manufacturer before resale back into the marketplace. And as we move into the outer loops, we can see here there's recycling, designing products and packaging to be made out of materials that can be collected, cleaned, and reconstituted back into building blocks that can be used in manufacturing. And finally, in the last and biggest loop, here in this recovery loop, we design products that can be collected and converted back into energy or carbon or small molecules, fed right back into the beginning of the system, all to be used again. But despite the ideas of these circular systems that are starting to flow out into our society, we're still quite limited to our current recycling flows, which were never designed to work effectively. And this is quite evident when we start to look at the numbers. Here in the big circle, we have all of the plastics ever created. And next we can see 55% of those plastics have been discarded into landfills. Here we have a smaller circle, which is around 10%. 10% of the plastics ever created have been burnt or incinerated, either just to get rid of them or for energy use. And here in our tiny little circle is our recycled circle. 7% of all the plastics ever made have been recycled. And the remaining 30% of plastics have leaked out of our system and are contaminating our natural environments, either as microplastics or macroplastics floating in the ocean, in the soils, in the air. Plastics have been found at the top of the highest mountain, at the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches. And it's unbelievable how pervasive they have really become. But many of the challenges of our recycling system really come down to our leading recycling method, mechanical recycling, as well as the complexity of plastics that are available in the marketplace today. In this system, a plastic goes through a piece of plastic is collected. It then goes through a series of sorting stages to separate out three types: HDPE, which is high density polyethylene, polypropylene or PP, and polyethylene terephthalate, which is PET. These are the three main plastic types that can actually be reused within our systems. Everything else, black plastics, PVC, small pieces of plastics, multi-laminated, thin films, they all get collected and sent to the landfill. And of the material that remains for reuse, this is not usually the best quality. These materials are often made up of 10 to 15% plastic contaminants. So that means that they're blends of different types of plastic materials. And because they're blends, they often have inferior qualities to virgin-like plastics. And so this downgrading of plastic really means that these materials don't flow within our system for very long or very well. To strengthen this flow, however, there are alternative technologies that are coming online. And these technologies create materials which are intended to flow within our systems more effectively. So the first type of technology that's really quite interesting is called solvent recycling. So here we take mixed plastic waste and we're able to dissolve it into a solvent. We can separate off the contaminants and the plastics can be reconstituted back into high quality recycled pellets. We also have feedstock recycling. So once again, we can take the mixed plastic waste and in this method, we break down the plastic back to its constituent building blocks. And then we take these building blocks and repolymerize or reform the plastic material to give high quality virgin-like plastics. And so both of these methods allow us to make a plastic material which is not contaminated with other plastics and shows very similar, if not exactly the same, mechanical and physical properties as the virgin materials themselves. But we can do even more to support the flow of our materials, like creating new flow systems altogether. So here we see the ecological cycle, and this cycle ensures that nutrients come back and rejuvenate the natural world. And bio-based materials are designed to fit into this cycle. In this system, materials come from agricultural or bio-based sources to make products. These products can flow and circulate within the system so that after use, they can provide us with things like biochemicals, bioenergy, and finally, they can return to the ecosystem through composting to feed the earth again. And so there's a lot of researchers, some of who I heard this morning doing amazing work, who are working on all of these systems, alternative methods of doing recycling with conventional plastics, as well as creating new types of plastic materials that will flow through our systems and could potentially add value and feed the earth, capturing that carbon and avoiding it being emitted into our atmosphere. So in the broader story of regeneration, energy and materials flow freely. We're able to use them to make the products we need every day, but our systems are designed to transform and return them back into atoms and molecules that can be used over and over again, leaving nothing to go to waste. Okay, so let's move on to our next story, one of equilibrium. Regenerative systems that we've talked about before have energy that flows back and forth. Systems that are in equilibrium are always in flux, moving between opposite extreme unstable states, but never staying in those states for long. When too much reactant is added into a system, it pushes that whole system forward to form products. And when there's too many products in the system, the equilibrium pushes it back to form the reactants. And this goes back and forth over and over until something external in that system changes. And every natural system is in balance, in this harmony or homeostasis. But this idea of balance is also about moving past the binary. Things are not either in balance or out of balance. They oscillate around a central idea where all pieces can fit together equally, equitably, and peacefully. Systems in equilibrium are resilient to extremism. For when change comes and the system moves to benefit one part, there are mechanisms designed in to allow for everything to adjust and come back into balance. So we've talked about the flow that our materials go through. And this flow can be thought of as their life cycle, moving from their beginnings and what they're made from to their end and what happens to their molecules after we've finished using them. And the energy that goes into moving products from one state to the next can have environmental, social, and economic impacts, both positive and negative. By analyzing these different stages and the potential impact, this allows us to balance, to plan, and become more informed about the products and practices we choose to use. So let's go through some of these considerations that come into play when we're trying to find this balance within our complex systems. Environmental impacts affect the air, the water, and the land. And these can include things like biodiversity and deforestation, thinking about whether the products we use or the practices we participate in lead to a decline in the number and variety of plant and animal species, or destruction of the forest areas, or even replacement of forests with agricultural land. We can also think about the toxicity and the chemicals that we use. Are we using materials that are harmful to humans or ecosystems? And we can think about air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Are we participating in activities that will continue to exacerbate the release of CO2 into the atmosphere or pump out noxious gases which could choke our cities? In systems which emphasize environmental impacts, generally we'll see environmental responsibility being promoted and will encourage the development of environmentally friendly technologies. Definitely not bad things to happen, but we also have to consider the whole. And so the next part of that whole is the social impacts. So when we're exploring social impacts, we want to examine how products and practices impact human health, liberty, and happiness. We want to consider workers, consumers, the local community, and the culture. The interactions between these groups and key impact categories, such as things like human rights, working conditions, health and safety, and cultural heritage, will highlight any social repercussions of the products or practices that we're hoping to do. And when we emphasize social impacts, we'll ensure that we have safe and healthy living conditions for all of the workers and people using those materials that we want to use. We'll have respect of Indigenous rights and have a greater connection to the land. We'll also ensure that the community is engaged and involved in all of the work and all the products and practices that we're hoping to promote within each region. And we'll also promote social responsibility within the businesses who are operating in that region as well. So once again, not bad things to hope for, but once again, we still have to think about the whole system and how these pieces could potentially interact with each other. And so the next piece of the pie we have are economic impacts. So when we're thinking of economic impacts for our products and packages, we hope to bring to light the effects on a region's economic health, its industrial capacity, or its built environment. Economic impacts help us analyze useful information on jobs, population growth, income, the gross regional product, and output. And when we're thinking about emphasizing these impacts, we'll most likely promote things like local employment, ensuring that people within the region have jobs in local businesses. We'll promote fair competition within the marketplace. We'll ensure that there's a respect of intellectual property rights and ensure that businesses are positively contributing to economic development as well as technology development. So with any system, focusing on only one aspect will push all the others out of alignment. And usually for the best results, especially within our current ecosystem, we might have to make compromises to make sure that we get the best from all of these different systems. And so we can take a deeper look into how some of these considerations come about by looking at my favorite landscape, my favorite example, the sustainable materials landscape. And so as I've said previously, to be in balance, we need to move past binary definitions. Is it sustainable or unsustainable? Is it good or is it bad? And at equilibrium, we aren't sitting at these extremes, but we're somewhere in the middle. And the same applies for the sustainable materials landscape. So we have two sort of spectrum, I guess you can call them. We have the beginning of life, which focuses on what things are made from. So these materials could be either bio-based or petroleum-based. We also have our other spectrum, which is the end of life considerations. And so this is where products go at the end of their useful life. And so products can either be recyclable or biodegradable. And so we have sustainable materials, which can fit into any of these four quadrants, each with their own positive and negative implications in those three areas: environment, social, and economic. And so there's lots of things to consider when we're wanting to make the choice on what product we want to be able to use. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the considerations for bio-based materials. So here we have bio-based materials. In the brown, we can see here that we have both positive and negative economic considerations. On the negative side, in this dark brown color, we can see that there's a high cost of these materials because of underdeveloped infrastructure. So the bioeconomy has really been around for a thousand years, since humans have really been walking on this planet. People have been using things like wool, hemp, or other types of animal products like leather to clothe themselves and to do different types of useful things within their communities. But now that we're wanting to transition to a larger scale bioeconomy, we need more connection between the different stakeholder groups. And because those connections haven't been fully developed yet, we're seeing that bio-based materials generally have a quite high cost associated with them. But on the other side, when we're thinking about positive economic considerations, by starting to transition into a bioeconomy or using bio-based materials, we see that there's an opportunity for us to have green chemicals and energy being developed from those materials. And also by shifting our reliance to more renewable energy and materials, we'll also improve our sustainable development. So here we have to weigh both the positive and negative economic impacts. And we can take another look, a deeper look into bio-based materials as well. And here, bio-based materials come from two different broad categories of feedstock. They can come from primary feedstocks, which are made from agricultural resources such as corn, wood, and sugarcane. And they can also be secondary feedstocks made from waste streams like oil and spent grain. And both of these different feedstocks have their own environmental considerations. On the primary feedstock side, we have in the dark blue some negative environmental consequences of using some of these materials. Because we're using monocultured agriculture to grow things like corn and sugarcane, this could potentially have an impact on land use as well as biodiversity. And growing those crops generally has a high water use. And when we're trying to convert those materials into different types of biochemicals or bioplastics, this also could have high energy use as well. On the other side, we have in the light green some positive environmental impacts of using secondary feedstocks. First of all, because we're using waste streams, we're diverting these waste streams from the landfill, which is great because organic waste in the landfill has high environmental impacts. And we're also having lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to the fossil-based counterparts. And that's simply because we're using waste streams, which would usually be disposed of, rather than trying to use primary agriculture like corn and sugarcane. But both of these different feedstocks have a positive socioeconomic benefit in that we're supporting local farmers and giving them additional revenue streams by being able to use either their corn itself or the corn husks and waste streams as an input for an entire new bioeconomy. And so here, when we're trying to decide between whether or not we should use a bio-based material or petroleum-based, we have all of these different considerations that we need to think about and balance in order for us to find a true pathway forward. And we can also look at the end of life considerations. So what is done with the material after we use it? And so here in this diagram, we have a huge variety of renewable materials. Some of them plastics, some of them not plastics, some of them recyclable, some of them biodegradable. And so here we have many, many materials to use. And if we're thinking about which ones are the most sustainable, we really have to think about what that material is going to be used for and where it's going to go at the end of its life. So here in Canada, we've had a big conversation about single-use plastics and should we be using single-use plastics? And there's a big drive to ban a large majority of these. And so when we're thinking about certain types of plastics and how they're going to be used, if you have a single-use material like a piece of cutlery or a paper plate, does it make sense for that material to be used once and then sent straight to landfill? Or can we use a bio-based material that could be used? If it's mixed with food waste, it can then go to a compost facility and biodegrade, helping to deliver that food waste into the compost facility and making sure it doesn't end up in the landfill. On the other hand, if we wanted to make a bio-based plastic bottle, which has a very well-defined recycling stream, it doesn't really make sense for us to make that biodegradable. It would make more sense for us to make that recyclable, so it fits into our current recycling systems. And so once again, there are lots of things to balance when we're thinking about what types of materials to use and how we can most effectively move towards making more sustainable choices. So in the story of regeneration, equilibrium is about bringing systems into balance. By understanding the impacts of our products and practices, this will give us more clarity as to what choices we should be making as we try to move forward into a cleaner and greener future. Okay, our third and final story, and this is a story of entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder, and the entropy of any closed system always increases. And I find it so interesting to think about systems and how they always tend towards disorder and chaos. And I really think about this like baking a cake or making dinner. Your kitchen starts off at a low level of disorder. Pots and plates and pans stored in their cupboards and drawers. And first you take out a bowl, then you take out your measuring cups, and then you take out the flour. And eventually your kitchen is at a very high level of disorder. And making products are the same. We take minerals and materials from out of the environment where they're stored with a relatively low level of disorder. And by the time they've flown through our systems, we have minerals and materials that are spread across the planet. Unlike your kitchen, however, it's much harder to bring things back into order. Another challenge we face when moving towards sustainability is ignoring the fact of life that change is a constant. We have many systems, institutions, policies, and regulations that are designed for static environments. Instead, we need to design systems that incorporate and rely upon change and fluctuation. And there are some systems that have been designed to bring this disparate material back into one place to be used again. So this idea of closing the loop is one way that we can work with entropy. If we understand that materials need to be collected and brought back to a low level of disorder, then we can start to design systems to do exactly that. We can create reuse services like your local cup share program or your takeaway container reuse program. And so that we can make sure that we aren't losing our products to entropy by simply making sure that they come back to be used again. And we can also design systems that make the most out of disorder. So like thinking about food waste or organic waste. So instead of sending that material to the landfill, we can first feed animals, and then we can start to make natural biomaterials like leather and feathers for pillows. We can then use that waste and have it undergo biochemical transformations to produce bio-derived plastics. We can render that material to separate the greases and the fats to be used for soaps, cosmetics, and pharmaceuticals. We can then go through anaerobic digestion processes to generate biogas and energy. And finally, composting to fix that carbon back into the soil for more plants to grow and for it to be used again. If we follow this cascade, we'll achieve maximum value from our secondary resources. And all that we would require is a system to manage this redistribution of that waste. But the complexity that entropy brings has more hidden benefits. Self-assembly arises from that disorder. Like crystallization from a supersaturated solution, or the way that plants grow and grow as they emerge new leaves. Given a specific set of rules, like any natural system, humans can start to self-organize themselves in a way that's increasingly complex and making different formations. Self-assembled systems can evolve to survive almost any change, simply by changing itself. All that it requires are regulations and rules that enable innovation, as well as enforcement that ensures accountability. And we can support these systems by advocating for policies that support this new way of organizing like grassroots efforts that consider the needs of the community, or startups that are innovating new ideas and technologies. An alternative way of organizing that I work towards is called urban biocycling. And so if you think about a city, and a city that functions like an ecosystem, it creates and uses its own nutrients, energy, and material. So urban centers are growing as more and more people move from rural areas to access greater quality and amenities. And with this growing population comes the generation of a huge amount of organic waste. And so our growing cities face many challenges. A few of them in particular are centered around organic and food waste, are our fragile food systems. In Vancouver, where I live in British Columbia, we import almost 90% of our food from outside the province. And so you can imagine when the floods happened in September, October of last year, and Vancouver was shut up from the rest of Canada, how quickly we realized the fragility of our food systems. We also have our organic waste being trucked very long distances, either being trucked to the US to go to landfills there, or trucked out into the rural areas of BC to go to compost facilities. And not even to mention the huge amount of space that's required for landfills. I recently went to the Vancouver landfill and I was just blown away by the size of that space. But if we're able to organize ourselves into an urban biocycle, we could use this organic waste to our advantage. Hi again, everybody. Sorry for that brief technical difficulty. But yes, okay, we'll dive back into these ideas around urban biocycling. So we're talking about how our systems currently are fragile, and in a system of self-organization around urban biocycling, we can think about alternative ways of organizing our cities. What if urban centers had hundreds of micro-farms that could create a robust local food network while adding to our organic waste streams? And what if new buildings, apartments, and condos had to have gardens in each unit? What if we could use this waste as an input for biomaterials and fertilizer and energy? And what if we could map out where the waste was being generated and direct it to places where that waste could be used again? What if we had machines in our homes that converted organic waste from the kitchen and bathroom into energy to run our homes and to run our communities? And what if we had local fabrication centers that had machines to convert organic waste into biomaterials for use in reusable containers, for building materials, or even other household items? And what's really interesting is that all these technologies exist, but what we need to do is bring them into the city and create the systems to allow them to work together. So that's my dream of a self-assembled city, or an urban biocycled city. So in the story of regeneration, policymakers and regulators, they don't shy away from disorder. Rather, they create rules to guide self-organization of communities. And this is so that our communities can build structures and systems that work for them and allow them to continue to grow, evolve, and endure. So those are my three stories for regenerative systems. Energy and the way a product or materials flow through our systems. Equilibrium and how we can balance the environment, society, and economy to create resilient and equitable systems. And finally, entropy and how we can lean into change and into the disorder that it brings to find ways to organize ourselves that will lead us to persevere. But these are just my stories. I encourage everybody watching this talk and throughout the conference this week to start dreaming up your own solar punk stories and to share them with your friends, your colleagues, your loved ones, so that we can all start to co-create this vision for a future and a culture that protects and connects. So once again, I'm Dr. Love-Ese Chile, and it's been my absolute pleasure to speak with you all today. I'm happy to answer any questions the audience might have. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chile. That was oh my goodness, that was an incredible presentation. And you're a great storyteller and an educator. And I want to say on behalf of all the students and that absolutely detest organic chemistry and chemistry, thank you for making chemistry exciting and accessible to those who are listening this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Juliet.
You're welcome. And I hope that everyone is as inspired and eager as I am to join the solar punk movement. So we have a couple of questions so far. So societies are not great on subtle gray zone or long-term plans that are forward-looking. How do we influence our politicians to consider something past binary?
That's a fantastic question. And it's not a question I necessarily have an answer to today, but it's really just about sustainability is about compromise. We don't live in a sustainable world. We're in a time of transition, which means that we're moving from one world to the next. And so things are going to be shades of gray or shades of green, as I like to call them. And so what I would really like to see from our policymakers is more of a roadmap than saying, we're going to do this today, and this is the only policy we're going to implement. But why don't we have a longer term strategy? So today we're going to make this small step, and then in 2 years, we're going to take this next step, and so on and so forth. I get frustrated when I see things, when I see regulations which are just, this is the thing that we're putting into place today, and we're not going to come back to it. We're not going to revise it as the ecosystem changes. So I want to see more of a roadmap. I want to see the steps towards the future that we want to create, rather than just saying we've done this one thing and that's it for us. And so I encourage people when they're talking to their to policymakers and their representatives to ask them for the roadmap, or to work with them in building that roadmap, so that we can make those steps forward together towards that place we want to be.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I guess that also ties into the, educating the general public about the fact that science isn't static either. When we get new data or new evidence, we modify and we change. That doesn't mean that we don't know what we're doing, which is something that tends to happen as well. Another question is, what are your views on plastics marketed as enzyme degradable? And what are some of the ways we can improve the current composting and recycling programs in Canada?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So there's a lot of different types of degradable plastics out there in the marketplace today. Some are more greenwashed than others. And it does become very challenging to navigate this landscape. So from my knowledge of the space, enzyme degradable plastics are generally conventional plastics like your polyolefins, which have an additive which has been included in them to help microbes degrade them. And in some cases, I haven't seen data that's been very convincing to me, to be honest. And I can't really say, as you said, as scientists, we can only work with the information that we have. And one of the challenges that I face as a researcher and a business owner is that a lot of the information is under NDA, or it's kind of hidden away within businesses. But with the enzyme degradable materials, where I find an interesting opportunity is in bio-based plastics, which also have an which are enzyme degradable. So now we have a material that's inherently biodegradable, but now we're trying to accelerate that degradation by adding another additive inside of it. But as I've said, nothing is black and white. There's always shades of green. And so I would really like to see information on the toxicity of those additives, information about the long-term effects on the environment when we're putting them into different ecosystems. So it's kind of a broader conversation to be had.
Yes, definitely.
Sorry, Julie, could you repeat the second half of that question for me?
What are some of the ways we can improve the current composting and recycling programs in Canada?
Yes, so I have many thoughts and feels about this, but I'll try to narrow it down. When I'm thinking, okay, so I'm going to separate composting and recycling into two kind of different spaces. So first, with regards to recycling, some of the challenges that we have are that across the waste management industry, is that we simply just don't have enough businesses who are doing those processes. So if we had I think across Canada, most provinces don't have only a handful of composting facilities and a handful of recycling facilities as well. So what we really need is investment in more recycling facilities, as well as more diverse types of recycling processes as well. So the solvent-based ones and the feedstock ones that I've mentioned. The composting facilities is a little bit different. And so I've been navigating this space for a while, and there's just a lot of competing values within this space. So if you think about traditional composters, they're generally very like this sustainability minded. They're all about creating materials that will feed the earth and allow plants and things to grow. When we ask compost operators to take on bio-based materials, we're asking them to change the way that they view themselves. So they're no longer generating compost, they're now waste management facilities, and that may not be what they've wanted to be. And so when I think about composting operations, I think about separating these two things and separating them so that we have a facility which knows that they're mostly there to manage this type of material, process it however they need to create an organic product, which may not be used in agriculture, but could be used for other things. And so that's a lot of the work that I do at the Waste Labs, is recognizing that if it doesn't fit into our traditional composting processes, how might we be able to create technologies and create systems that have a different value system? It's less about creating organic compost to put into the soils for plant growth, but it's more about managing that waste material and potentially feeding it back into our economic systems or into our manufacturing systems. And so there just needs to be a bit more nuance to that conversation, and recognizing that the traditional compost operators just have a different value system than waste management people who are just trying to feed materials back into our manufacturing streams.
That's true. There is a difference. I have a couple more questions here. Hopefully we have enough time to get to them all. So another question is, you referenced the way in which knowledge of the scale of the plastic problem can lead to apathy among citizens. How do you suggest striking that balance for those of us who are not as adept at storytelling as you are? I fall into that place of despair often. I think anybody in the sustainability feels the pendulum swings between blooming and glooming. For me, I really try, recognizing that this is a global issue and that if countries all across the world are facing this plastics problem. But for me, I try to focus on our local systems, like here in BC and Canada. How can I change my community? How can I create solutions that add value into the community that I'm currently living in? And how can I change myself and my family's way of working and operating and doing things, so that I can at least know for myself and my family that I'm mitigating my piece of the puzzle? So there's a quote out there. It says, like, we don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need a large number of people doing zero waste imperfectly, because it's really, as I've said, we are transitioning into a sustainable world. So we have to take one step at a time. So if it's just simply taking your reusable bags or your reusable cup every day in your backpack or in your bag, like that's a starting off point. And once you've kind of got that as like your baseline, you can now move to the next step. Okay, I'm going to start to go to a zero waste grocery store every week. And so just keep making those small steps towards where you and your family see your green vision. That's excellent. That's an excellent recommendation. Another question here is, what would you recommend to product developers and companies specializing in product development? What should they be focusing on when they're developing their sustainable products?
They should, I talk to product developers often in my line of work. And so at the Waste Labs, we have this idea called we begin at the end. So if you take waste management is generally an afterthought. People are like, oh, okay, I'll make my product. And then only at the very end do they think about what's going to happen to that material. For us, we think about that waste management at the very beginning, because you're going to be deciding, depending on what your product is meant to be used for, you'll be able to know what your product, what end of life your product will most likely be destined for. And you can start to make design choices based on that end of life. So we can think about if you're designing If you're designing fishing lures, for example, if you know that your fishing lures are most likely going to end up in marine water, you might want to design that to be degradable in marine water if those types of materials are available to you. But if you know that your product is going to be able to be rinsed out and cleaned very easily, it's not going to be contaminated with food waste, then you can start to design for recycling streams. And when you design for recycling, you can make sure that you don't have small pieces which might fall through the system. You can make sure everything's kind of connected. It's only one color, for example. And so you can make specific choices to ensure that that product ends up in the right waste stream. And so that material doesn't end up going to the landfill or contaminating the natural environment. So I say always think about the end of life when you're at the beginning of your design phase.
That's excellent. And okay, 2 more questions. I think we're running out of time a little bit, but this is an interesting question. In developing countries, it's not easy to repair damaged equipment or materials because, of course, sometimes it's more expensive. So what would you recommend that governments in developing countries do to address and tackle some of these issues?
That is another fantastic question. And it's definitely a challenge. And I'm not super equipped to answer the question because I myself haven't grown up in a developing country, so don't have all of the knowledge about how these systems operate. But for me, what I would really invest in is investing in training for people to do that repair. So if we think about, the 1950s in the West, you could take your shoes or whatever it was to a repair shop and somebody would be able to fix that thing for you. One of the biggest challenges we face today is that our products are not designed to be repaired. There's been some great movement in the EU for the right to repair movement, which is just fantastic, and I'm 100% on board. But if developing countries can put money into supporting those individuals in each community who can have a shop where you can, repair a variety of different things, that could be an opportunity there as well as having legislation to only allow certain products which have been, which are able to be repaired to come into their country. But that's a much harder kind of thing to ensure that people do.
Okay, we're out of time. So thank you to everyone who has logged on, especially on this Sunday afternoon, giving up your Sunday afternoon to hear Dr. Chile speak. That was an incredibly inspiring and motivating talk. And again, I'd like to thank our plenary sponsor, the University of British Columbia. And I'd also like to remind everyone to please join us tomorrow for plenary sessions beginning at 10 a.m., where we'll hear from Dr. Jude Kong and Dr. Evelyn Asidu. And of course, we have our mentorship program ongoing right now. Tomorrow, we'll also have a public panel discussion on Black health equity. So that promises to be also a really engaging panel discussion. And tomorrow's evening public panel discussion, as I said, is on the Black health equity. So I hope that many of you will show up for that as well. So thank you all once again. And thank you so much, Dr. Chile, for a fantastic seminar. And I really hope that we all join the solar punk movement and the right to repair movement, you said, I think it was. Yes, I am all committed to that as well. And so thank you again for spending the afternoon with us. And thank you for being a part of BESTEMM 2022, the first day of BESTEMM 2022. Have a wonderful evening.